China calls for stronger representation for the Global South. It's warning the international rules-based order is at a critical crossroads. Beijing says it has a solution to a more equitable system. Well, what is it, and does it have the tools to enforce it? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. Emerging economies remain underrepresented in global governance institutions. Now, those are the words of Beijing's foreign minister as he presented China's so-called white paper. He argued global governance should be more equitable and the role of the United Nations should be strengthened. In Beijing's stated view, all countries should have an equal voice in global affairs. Now, that means the Global South should have more representation. China's call comes as the world is engulfed in many armed conflicts and facing serious economic challenges. But is Beijing now presenting itself as a leader of the Global South? When will it be able to garner enough support to play that role? We'll talk to our guests in a moment, but first, this report from Michael Apple.
I'm the boss.
As the spectacle of the G7, representing some of the world's biggest economies, drew to a close in France, on the other side of the world, China was setting out its case for equality and inclusivity on the global stage. It's what Beijing and many of its allies refer to as a new multipolar world.
We must fully leverage the key role of the Global South, promote the development of cooperation within the expanded BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization family, advance reforms of institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank, and continuously enhance the voice and representation of developing countries in international affairs.
There are some leaders in the so-called Global North who've publicly said the post-World War II rules-based international order is not functioning as advertised.
Call it what it is, a system of intensifying great power rivalry where the most powerful pursue their interests using economic integration as coercion.
Donald Trump speaks often of his disregard for institutions of multilateralism, the United Nations in particular.
These are the two things I got from the United Nations, a bad escalator and a bad teleprompter.
Many question whether the United Nations, founded more than 80 years ago, is still fit for purpose. Leaders from Africa and Latin America continue to call for reform to the Security Council and permanent seats with full veto powers. The Secretary General says that the nations entrusted with upholding the UN Charter are increasingly the same ones disregarding it.
And this erosion is not happening at the margins of the international system. It is happening at its core, including by states entrusted with unique responsibilities for the maintenance of international peace and security.
Beijing appears to be positioning itself as an advocate of the Global South. And with the release of China's new white paper on global governance, it's arguing not only should there be more voices at the table, but the table needs to be much, much larger. Michael Apple, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Well, let's bring our guests into the show now. We have joining us Steve Tsang. He's the director of the SOAS China Institute. He joins us from Nottingham in the United Kingdom. Cobus van Staden is head of research at the China Global South Project. He joins us from Cape Town. And Alan Carlson is associate professor in the government department at Cornell University. He joins us from Ithaca, New York. A warm welcome to all of you. If I could start with Cobus then. Now, how much of a blueprint is this white paper, do you think, Cobus, for international governance reform? Is the detail there for that?
I think it presents very kind of kind of big directions. It sets a kind of a set of destinations essentially, but it doesn't provide a lot of detail on how to get there. Kind of it's painting in broad strokes, I think, at this stage.
Steve, how effective is this initiative that's being proposed in the white paper known as the Global Development Initiative, or GDI? Is it a real solution to address some of the challenges of the current world order?
Well, it is not so much about confronting the current challenges. It is about China coming out openly advocating that there needs to be what China would call a democratization of international relations. In other words, the end of the democratic West defining the international order and the international norms, led the global South as led by and represented by China to shape it, since the global South, in both UN member state terms and in population terms, forms the overwhelming majority of countries and people in the world.
Alan, talking about redressing underrepresentation for the Global South, noble goals, but can the Global South carve out more influence for itself in global governance in a world, many would argue, is really dominated by power and realpolitik?
Yeah, there's very little room in international politics for altruism. When the US has led the existing international order, it's done so oftentimes in the name of promoting democracy, but most often serving its own interests. And I think the role that China is trying to carve out here, spearheading a similar initiative, we need to keep in mind that it's probably more serving China's interests than those of the Global South.
Steve, do you agree with that? This is really a cover for China to promote its own interests. And even if that wasn't the case, how would less powerful countries ever be able to restrain the will of more powerful ones, no matter what sort of multilateral institutions you come up with?
From our perspective, or an objective perspective, this is very much putting China first. But from Xi Jinping's perspective, that is not the case. From Xi Jinping's perspective, the interests of China, of the Communist Party of China, and the interests of the wider world are exactly the same. And therefore, what is good for China is good for the Global South and is good for the world. Now, does it work in the Global South? China is effectively offering a deal to the Global South. And let's be honest about it. A majority, or indeed most, of the countries in the so-called Global South are not democracies by the standards of European countries. Okay. And what China promised is that with their support in the UN for making reforms, China will protect them and make sure that no democracies can impose conditionalities on them, so they will get a fair bit of traction there.
Okay, Cobus, Steve said, China's offering the developing world a deal. Will they take it?
I think the developing world has a lot of stake based in trying to enlarge and create space for them in the global order. So I think, kind of whether China's priorities lead in that, in that process. For most of these countries, they are so far away from the levers of power. They feel so kind of misrepresented frequently by the order, that even a few steps towards greater sovereignty or greater inclusion is already a win for them. That doesn't necessarily mean that becomes, that they step into China's agenda, as a whole. But I think what we've seen in China's engagement with global South countries is that they tend to leave space there for the priorities of each country, and so I think for a lot of global South countries, that's already a win.
Alan, how do you think the global North, if we can call or developed world, how are they likely to respond to any effort by global South countries to try and have a greater say, greater influence in global decision making?
Yeah, I think in general there's a sense that the pie only has so many slices in it, and it's a zero-sum game in that regard. But within the framework of the kind of instability of American leadership of the existing international order, China becomes a lot more palatable in a redistribution that maybe includes not just Global South voices, but European voices and others, in contrast to the rather unilateralist direction of the Trump administration's approach to these things, I think really stands out. Let's note that the US has basically been walking away for the past year plus from the global institutions that it helped develop in the post-war and post-Cold War era. And so in that sense, there's a little bit of a vacuum here. And whether it's by intention or design or simply good fortune, I think China's stepping into it, and it presents options for other players, middle powers, developing countries around the globe.
Cobus in Cape Town. Alan was talking there about slices of the pie. Is it a matter of carving up the pie differently, or is it time for the Global South to have its own pies? And what I mean by that is the issue in global decision-making and underrepresentation in global institutions. Well, is it a case that really these institutions just need to be reformed, or these institutions don't really represent the balance of political and economic power anymore in the world, and maybe different mechanisms are needed?
I think it may be both, because the white paper is interesting in that it invests a lot of energy into the current global order. So for example, the UN, the World Trade Organization, and so on. So it's calling for reforming these from a Global South perspective, which would already be a very radical thing to do. And then at the same time, China is also instrumental in setting up a series of new and alternative institutions, including something like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, for example, which is an alternative lender. So I think China is making space for both of those processes at the same time. What I think the challenge would be is how the more established powers, who sit at the center of the older global order, how they will actually react to that pressure.
All right, Steve, Cobus mentioned there some of the initiatives, setting up a development bank. BRICS countries have even talked about having their own currency. Does any effort for greater influence by the Global South countries necessarily mean tension with the developed world powers, or could it be done harmoniously?
Well, the Chinese will say that it can, of course, be done harmoniously, provided the developed countries, including the United States, play ball.
That's a big provided, though, isn't it, Steve? I'm sure we'll remember July 6th last year, Donald Trump posting on social media, threatening any country aligning themselves with what he called the anti-American policies of BRICS will be charged an additional 10% tariffs.
Well, that may be so. That, in fact, was exactly Donald Trump playing to the tune of the Chinese music, because China suddenly has been elevated to the moral pedestal, defending the rights of Global South countries and people against a global hegemon who is behaving badly and showing that the current international system with the United States leading is not working. And it is, in fact, bullying, is bad hegemony. So the more evidence from their perspective that Donald Trump provided for a need to change the system.
All right, Steve mentioned their bullying hegemony. Maybe it's a good time to pause for a second and look at some of the data on how the rest of the world views the US in the form of a global survey known as the Democracy Perception Index. Now, it represents the views of more than 94,000 respondents across nearly 100 countries. It shows that for the first time, the United States is viewed more negatively than both Russia and China. Now, if you look at the graph there, the turning point appears to have been in 2023 when President Biden was still in office. but perception seems to drop even more rapidly in 2024. Now, looking at that sort of graphic, I've got to ask the question, Cobus, can the US be rehabilitated back into the rules-based order nations from the perspective of the global South?
I think it could. For example, if the US, like it's notable, as you said, it's that fall starting in 2023, which of course, coincides with the beginning of the genocide in Gaza, and I think a process which has really, I think, reshaped the views from many global South countries of global North power. But at the same time, if say the US kind of recommits itself to actual democracy, if it recommits itself to a climate solution, for example, that's more inclusive, then yeah, absolutely. I think everyone would love to work with the United States. I think people still depend on the United States a lot. I think what is the issue is bringing together global North and global South concerns, and particularly kind of putting global South concerns at the center of global decision making, which that is a big kind of systemic kind of shift. But I think the US could be instrumental in making that happen.
Alan, does the US want to be rehabilitated back into multilateral institutions? When you look at statements that have been made by this administration and the first Trump administration about multilateralism and multilateral institutions, you would be forgiven for having a bit of a question mark in your mind. Should we put it that way?
Yeah, I'll add, and it might be trivial, but the U.S. is hosting the World Cup right now, and there was plenty of concern about how that sporting event would unfold. And so far, the first round has been fabulous. It's really been a showcase for global talent and for the role that America can play, despite American politics and the direction domestic politics have gone in. I think what's kind of interesting to note, picking up a little bit on what Steve had said and Cobus as well, the white paper that China issued recently on global governance didn't mention the United States once by name. It talked about kind of hegemonic powers and bullying. But it's the elephant in the room. U.S. positioning over a couple of administrations, I think it's more pronounced under President Trump. And I believe this has more to do with American domestic politics than structural issues in the global economy. But as a result, everyone, I think, is looking to figure out what's going to happen next and what will best be to their advantage. And that does seem to provide China with an opening to position itself as a global leader.
The white paper didn't mention the US even once. That's a really important point there. And I'm wondering, Steve, what does that tell us? Does that tell us that China, the global South, are already planning, whether they say outright or not, for a future in which the US remains a force outside the international rules-based order institutions and mechanisms?
No, I don't think that necessarily implies that. What it does imply is how much more sophisticated Chinese diplomacy has become. There is no need for the Chinese to mention the United States by name, because everybody could see by implication which country is behaving as the global hegemon. By not mentioning the US by name, it also avoids the association simply with the Trump administration. The implication is that it is a structural problem that the existing global hegemon behaves badly, and therefore projects the image that the problems of bad American behavior under particularly the second Trump administration is structural and likely to continue beyond Trump. Now, that may not be the case in the US. I think that's what Cobus was implying, that the US can be rehabilitated in the world opinions post-Trump. But the Chinese are not going to help the Trump administration or the United States with that. They would like the United States to be seen in a negative light for as long as people are willing and able to do so.
Cobus, we're kind of talking about the Global South as if it's a unified entity. We do have to ask, is there enough consensus within the Global South over the agenda, over the methods to achieve a more equitable global order?
I think this is probably one of the reasons why the document puts the reforms in such broad terms, because I think it implies a kind of a process of dialogue that to hone in on more specific goals. And as you say, the global south is very varied, so it's very difficult to talk about its priorities as a whole. But I do think certain key priorities are shared. One is climate security, I think. Another is the right and access to development. And also kind of issues of sovereignty within the global system. So those cut across, I think, the many of the other kind of beefs and disagreements that individual global south countries would have.
Alan, is the question of global consensus a broader one than simply the global south? Is there enough global consensus by any part of the world on any of the major issues left to salvage? Or is the reality simply that we're living in an increasingly ever-fractured world?
I think the world has always been pretty fractured. Maybe those differences have been papered over better at various points in time, but especially today, especially when there are questions about what position America is taking on the global stage, what China will look like.
Forgive me if I'm wrong here, Alan, but wasn't it different when we lived in the bipolar world order, where you had two major blocs, and on a lot of issues at least, you'd see countries coalesce around either polar?
Yeah, but we were all kids back then. That was like going on 40 years ago, so it was a while. I think that what we've had since then, though, is a kind of American leadership, American hegemony that has at times been self-serving, but has provided a degree of stability, at least on the surface. Beneath the surface, Cobus, speaking from Africa was largely left out of that order, both economically and in terms of its own security. I think the change is that possibly China's rise on the world stage offers a different framing, a different set of options, frankly, money that wasn't coming from Western sources in terms of trade and investment. And that, maybe more than the rhetoric and the diplomacy and statements in the UN General Assembly, is what could change what's actually unfolding in various parts of the world.
Okay, listening to that, I'm wondering, Steve, if we are seeing a change in the global balance of power, which are what I think Alan is saying there. And in that case, this call by China, by Beijing, to strengthen some of the multilateral institutions like the United Nations, is that really the effective answer to strengthen institutions that don't really represent the reality of the global balance of power? And especially as well, if we're seeing global powers deciding to act outside of them.
I think what we have to understand is that the Chinese are not just trying to change it. The Chinese are going to transform those international organizations from within and make them answerable first and foremost to the global south as represented and led by China, instead of being dominated by the democratic West, headed by the United States. It is a big transformation. Now, whether it will make the world a better place or not is not their problem.
Is that likely to happen, do you think? I'm just imagining if that came up for a vote in the Security Council, you can't imagine a lot of the Security Council powers other than China, especially Western ones, wanting to sign up for that.
Yeah, I think there's lots of questions about the way in which the UN could be reformed. Security Council reform is particularly difficult. There's also a question of general assemblies and various agencies. There, Steve's former colleague, Rosemary Foote, has done incredible work looking at the way that Beijing increased its sort of influence and voice in the UN. So I think there's both changes within the UN and then also the development of institutions that China and the Global South lead, whether thinking about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or other dispute resolution mechanisms that are outside the context of the UN framework.
Cobus, does the Global South want China to lead the drive for better, more equitable representation in international institutions?
I think the Global South, well, again, it's hard to talk for it's such a varied group. I think it'll differ by country, but and many of those countries may have issues with China, broader or more specific ones. But I think in general, the kind of spearheading of this kind of conversation, this kind of movement by China ends up opening gaps, I think, for Global South countries to maneuver within the system. I think particularly from an African perspective, what the main thing isn't whether China or, say, India or different Global South country is spearheading this. The issue is how little representation Global South countries have in the current system, and how kind of entrenched, the leadership or the dominance by a small group of rich countries remain in the global system, particularly because we know that in the post-World War II system that, that system was built up around US and European power. So, for the kind of the ex-colonized world, moving into more of a kind of a space of control, no matter who leads that process, that remains the big historical trajectory that still needs to be completed. And so, I think as a kind of a demographic kind of weight kind of emerges in places like Africa, there's a limit to how long these populations will tolerate being that excluded from the global system, particularly considering by like 2050, 1 in 4 people in the world will be African, Right. So it's so for that reason, any change is necessary.
Change is coming, it seems to be. The sentiment of all of our guests, at least on that point. Let's thank them at this point. Steve Tsang, Cobus van Staden and Alan Carlson. And thank you too for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For now, that's it from me, Sami Zeidan, and the whole team here. Al Jazeera's coverage continues in a moment, so stay tuned.